Good afternoon. My name is Lee Fullington-Haase. I direct the California program of the New America Foundation, a public policy think tank based in Washington, D.C. and here in Sacramento. On behalf of New America and our irreplaceable co-sponsor, the California Research Bureau, I'm delighted to welcome you all here today, and especially today's speaker, my colleague, Professor Tomas Jimenez, who will be delivering a talk titled From Pluribus to Unum, Immigrant Integration in California's Future. One central fact, and perhaps the central fact, about the perennial debate over immigration in California is that most undocumented immigrants will remain here. This fact doesn't remove the need for a rational, equitable immigration policy that takes the rights of California's citizens into account. What it does do, or what it ought to do, is to put the issue of integration squarely in the spotlight. At New America, Irvine Fellows Gregory Rodriguez and Tomas Jimenez have been in the forefront in studying the ways in which integration takes place and the obstacles to this process. Jimenez received his undergraduate degree from Santa Clara University and holds a PhD from Harvard University. He's published op-eds in the San Francisco Chronicle, the LA Times, and the San Diego Tribune, among others, and he's been featured in immigration policy in Time magazine and NBC Nightly News. He's currently completing a book due out in 2009 on how Mexican immigration to California influences the integration of Mexican Americans who already live in the state. We're looking forward today to hearing some of the findings from that work, and pleased and delighted to welcome you to Sacramento.
Thank you for being here this afternoon. Thank you to Lee for that nice introduction, and the New America Foundation, as if they didn't need yet another plug, for hosting me as a fellow for the past year and hopefully for the next year. It's a really wonderful opportunity to translate some of what I do in my academic writing for a broader audience. And I also want to thank the California Research Bureau for co-hosting this event. What I hope to do in the next half hour or so is first to get this thing to work. It was working a minute ago. There we go. Okay, it just had to warm up. I want to talk about, begin by talking about California's newcomers. I want to talk about who they are. Generally speaking. I want to then get a definition of what integration is. I did an interview, and in talking to some of you prior to coming up here, you had questions about the difference between assimilation and integration, so perhaps we'll get into that. I want to talk about the state of immigrant integration in the state. I want to talk about what I think are a couple of significant roadblocks, and then we'll talk about the integration imperative, why immigrant integration is so vitally important for our state's future. And I want to talk about some ways that we might help create a positive trajectory of integration for our state's newcomers and for those who are already settled here. So first, an overview. Who are California's newcomers? California is the quintessential immigrant state. More than a quarter of the state's population was born in another country. Almost 10 million individuals born in another country. And if you look at this in comparative perspective, compare it to other states in the Union, California is first in terms of the size of the immigrant population in percentage terms, but also in absolute numbers. Nearly 1 in 3 foreign-born individuals in the United States lives in California. And we often have a perception that immigrants in California are recently arrived, that they have just crossed our borders or just deboarded a plane or have just gotten off a boat, and that's not exactly true. About half of immigrants in California today came in the 1980s or before. They are what we call long-term settled population, and the other half have come since 1990. So it is a mix of people who are both settled and people who have been here for a long time. It will not surprise many of you to know that most of California's immigrants come from our southern neighbor, Mexico. About 44%, or about 4.4 million individuals who were born in Mexico live in California. Another 750,000 come from the Philippines, and then China comes a third, and then you have various other countries that make up a fairly significant percentage of, or a proportion of the immigrant population. But the big picture here is that Mexico dwarfs all other countries as a source of immigration. What do things look like historically? Despite the fact that over a quarter of today's Californians come from another country, there was actually a time when a higher percentage of California's population came from another country. If you go back prior to the turn of the last century, as high as 38% of California's population was born abroad. And California's immigrant population in percentage terms is indicated here by the gold bars, given that we're the Golden State, and the rest of the United States by the black bars. And California has always been ahead in terms of percentage of immigrants of the United States, and today in particular. But the immigrant population is changing in California. It's changing in a fairly significant way. Starting in the 1990s, the California immigrant population shifted. It shifted from being a population that was dominated by newcomers to a population that is more dominated by the long-term settled immigrant population. This is a nice figure made by my friend and colleague Dowell Myers at USC, and you can see that the red portion of these bars here indicate the proportion of the immigrant population that are newly arrived, that is people who've come within the last 10 years. And then the settled immigrant population is indicated by the yellow bar here. And you see that from 1990 to 2000, the settled population started taking over as a percentage of all immigrants in the state. And projecting forward, Dowell Myers tells us that that pattern will continue well into the future. So we have a population that is becoming increasingly settled, as Leif mentioned in his opening remarks. Now, the big elephant in the room, of course, or perhaps the elephant in the room, are the unauthorized population. And here it's worth a note on terminology. We talk oftentimes about illegal immigrants. We talk oftentimes about what some people perceive to be a more PC term, and that's undocumented immigrants. I'm going to complicate things further, just messy things up here a little bit, and introduce the term unauthorized. And I do that not to be PC, and I do that not to just muddy the waters, but because I think it's analytically more accurate. It is not entirely accurate to call a population illegal, as if the sum total of their being in the United States is determined by whether or not they cross the borders with or without authorization. It's not accurate to call people undocumented. 40% of the quote-unquote unauthorized population in the United States came here with documents. They overstayed their visas. And the other 60%, many of them have documents. They're not valid documents, but they have documents. So we say that this is an unauthorized population. They are not authorized to be here. Okay, I digress. We have a big unauthorized population in California. I'm sure many of you will not be surprised to hear this. About one quarter of all unauthorized immigrants in the United States live in California. And that means that there's about 2.8 million. But much like the immigrant population as a whole, the unauthorized population, its growth rate has actually decreased. In the 1990s, California was receiving about 100,000 unauthorized immigrants a year. In the most current decade, that number has come down to about 50,000 a year. So unauthorized immigration has actually slowed. It's no surprise that the majority, 64%, come from California, and many people have made the argument that unauthorized immigrants are vital to our workforce, and at least the numbers would suggest that they indeed are. 1 in 11 people who work in California are here without authorization. And I think it's also worth noting that many of these individuals live in what we call mixed status families. That is, one member of the household lacks authorization, while others may be legal permanent residents, may have visas, or even be citizens. And I think it's worth calling our attention to the children who live in these households. Nationwide, 3.1 million children, U.S. citizen children, are living in households with at least one parent who is unauthorized. And we'll talk a little bit more of that in a second. When we talk about immigrant integration, as I'll point out in more detail in a second, we're not just talking about the immigrants themselves. We have to pay close attention to the descendants of these immigrants. And here again, it's worth noting something else on terminology. In social science, we refer, and I think this is kind of counterintuitive, so, and I'll let you blame me for this. It's counterintuitive, but we refer to the immigrant population as the first generation. The children of immigrants are the second generation, grandchildren third, great-grandchildren fourth, and so on and so on. So I just want to be clear about what I'm talking about when I say first, second, and third generation. And I want to call your attention here to the second generation children of immigrants, another important population in California, another important population when we talk about immigrant integration. Half of all of the people who live in California either have parents who were born in another country and they themselves were born in another country, or they were born in the United States but have parents who were born in another country. These are the population that we call immigrant stock. And I want to call your attention here to a couple of shifts. Again, this sort of depicts what I just said. Along the horizontal rows here, we have the first generation immigrants, second generation children of immigrants, and then the third plus generation, people who, at a minimum, it was their grandparents who came here. And just among the adults in the immigrant stock population, the foreign-born dominates. About 34% are foreign-born, while only 13% of California's adults are second generation. If you look at the children, those under 18, things flip. 41% of the state's children are born in the United States but have immigrant parents, and only 8.2% are immigrants themselves. So again, an important shift, and an important shift with respect to age. Just for emphasis here, each of these bars represents a different age group. The black portion represents the immigrant first generation, this sort of green turquoise portion is the second generation, and then the sort of peach colored here is the third generation. And you can see that second generation heavily concentrated among our youngest Californians. Okay, the question that many of you had from the beginning. I want to begin to talk about the integration of this population that I've just talked about. And before I do that, I want to talk about what exactly integration is. I think it's important to be clear about it. We, I think, have a caricature of the immigration debate that's been drawn for us on cable news channels, on talk radio, and the caricature presents the debate as being between people who think that certain individuals shouldn't be crossing the border, that the border should be sealed, and on the other side you have a group of people who are arguing that the border crossed them. And I think this caricature glosses over what's really at the heart of the immigration debate. It's not first and foremost about whether or not people are crossing the border. It's about what happens after they get here. It's about immigrant integration. Most of us do not live on the border. Most of us, when we interact with individuals from the host society or individuals who are immigrant stock, do so far away from the border. We do so at the grocery store. We do so at the bank, on the street, et cetera, et cetera. It's about integration. It's about integration. And so what is integration? This is the definition I'd like to present. Integration is an inevitable process wherein immigrants, their descendants, and the host population mutually adapt to one another over time. It's an inevitable process wherein immigrants, their descendants, and the host population mutually adapt to one another over time. I want to call your attention to three things about this definition. The first is that I call it inevitable. Sociologists from a previous era got in big trouble for calling what they use the term assimilation, for calling it inevitable. I would argue that it is, but its inevitability doesn't mean that it necessarily follows along a positive trajectory, either for the host population or those who are newcomers. But it is inevitable. Integration is happening. Our task today is to explain how it's happening. It's mutual. It's mutual. Immigrant newcomers and host population tend to reciprocate the way that they treat each other. If immigrant newcomers encounter a population that is relatively hostile, they tend to reciprocate that hostility. They tend to hunker down in a sense of ethnic identity that seems to be cordoned off from the rest of the host population. And likewise, if the host population has a relatively more welcoming response, then immigrants respond in kind. Integration is measured in time, and when we measure integration over time, we're not talking about minutes. A lot of us get really impatient. We think that if immigrants don't kind of get off the plane or cross the border and within 5 minutes speak fluent English, then something's wrong. English is being threatened. There's a reconquista going on. Oh my God, the United States is being torn apart. That integration's not happening. Integration has always been measured in generations. We often look back on our immigrant ancestors who came, many of them through Ellis Island, and think that when they got off the boat they spoke English in 5 minutes. I know that's not true. My own Italian ancestors came through Ellis Island, and I got to know them, and they did not speak English very well, even after being here for 70 years. So we measure it in generations, first, second, third generation. How do we know if it's happening? How do we know if integration's taking place? I want to cover a few measures here that I think are important. The first measure, and perhaps the most important measure, are socioeconomic indicators, and I'm really talking about educational attainment here. The second indicator is language. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, and I'll tell you why in a second. A third is intermarriage. Intermarriage is perhaps, according to social scientists, the yardstick of immigrant integration. And I also want to talk about identity, because again, I think identity is what we as kind of everyday citizens really think about. And so what do these things look like in California? What's the story that's being written right now about immigrant integration in California? I first want to talk about these socioeconomic indicators, namely educational attainment. Education tends to be the linchpin for other measures of immigrant integration. If immigrants are getting lots of education, integration usually goes well. If they're not, integration usually does not go so well. And here we have a breakdown. This is by race group and generation. And I want to call your attention to this category of less than high school. I'm doing that partly in the interest of time, but also because I think it is analytically important. The gap in earnings and sort of general success in American society between those who don't have a high school degree and those who do is vast. It's also big between those who have a college degree and everyone else, but I want to focus on this aspect right here. And generally speaking, we think that integration's happening, just paying attention to this less than high school category, if there are fewer and fewer people dropping out of high school as time goes on. And that appears to be the case here for virtually all groups. And these are big groups, and I want to break these down in a little more detail in a second. But this is what appears to be happening for virtually all groups. I want to break this down in more detail, and that's why I'm going a little bit fast on that slide, and I'll slow down here. Again, paying attention to this less than high school diploma category and looking at how people do relative to their parents. How do the second generation children of immigrants do in terms of education relative to their foreign-born parents? And the story being written here is that integration is happening for every single group. If you look at all ethnic groups, the percentage who have less than a high school degree in the first generation goes from 38% down to 10%. Mexicans, by far the biggest population, both in the immigrant generation and the second generation. 3/4 of Mexican immigrants in the state. I'm sorry, this is nationwide now, I should mention too. I don't have the data for the state. But this is you get a pretty good sense of what's going on in the state from this. 75% of Mexican immigrants have less than a high school diploma. Among their children, only 14% lack a high school diploma, or it goes down to 14%, I shouldn't say only 14%. Central Americans, the story is similar. Among Southeast Asians, almost 30% come here without a high school degree, but among their children, 98% are finishing high school. That's pretty remarkable. Among other Asian groups, 99% have at least a high school degree, up from 84%. And among whites, a similar story. If we look at the progress that the third generation grandchildren of immigrants make over their second generation parents, the story is similar. And here the percentages among the second generation are going to be different than these second generation percentages because it's a different population. Again, these data measure how people are doing directly relative to their parents. So these are not exactly the same people in both second generations. And the story is much the same. Among all ethnic groups, that percentage declines. Even among Mexicans, it declines still high. Still very high in the third generation. Among Asian groups, that proportion declines, and among whites, it declines. So we don't have Southeast Asian up here because, we don't have Southeast Asian up here because the population of third generation is simply too small. So what's the story here? The story is that there's overall progress. That the integration trajectories where socioeconomic indicators are concerned suggests that people are doing better than their parents, and that's good news. But some groups are doing a lot better than others. Some of those high school incompletion rates are still far too high, particularly among Latino groups and Mexicans in particular. Why would that be? What's going on? Well, social scientists have marshaled a few explanations. The first and probably most obvious is parents' background. We tend to inherit our parents' class status, their socioeconomic status. If our parents have lots of education and lots of money, we also tend to have lots of education and lots of money, and ideally, if the American dream's working, we tend to have even more. And so the children of immigrants, the third generation, is in fact inheriting their parents' class status. A lot of their parents are coming here with very low levels of education, very little income, and children of immigrants or grandchildren are improving on their parents' lot, but improving only so much as their parents' socioeconomic status allows them. Their parents' English language proficiency is incredibly important too. Parents who speak English proficiently are able to participate in their children's lives in ways that improves the monitoring that most of us parents, I'm not a parent yet, so I shouldn't claim to be, but when I eventually do become a parent, I want to monitor my kids, and I'm assuming most of you will, and speaking English helps us do that. Legal status, a significant handicap for parents and children who lack it. The expectations that peers and educators have of students in California dramatically shapes how well they do. There was an article in the LA Times a couple of weeks ago about a high school in Orange County. It's split down the middle between Asian and Latino students, and students and teachers agreed that everyone kind of just expects a lot more from the Asian students and sort of expects the Latino students to not be so good at school and to be a little bit and to be troublemakers. And students tend to follow suit. They tend to follow the labels that are handed to them. And then growing up in poor neighborhoods, going to overcrowded and underfunded schools doesn't help. In the interest of time, a friend of mine and colleague at UC Irvine, Cynthia Feliciano, has written about how immigrant selectivity affects integration of immigrants. That is, how different the immigrants are who come here from the people who don't immigrate, and finds that immigrant groups that have a lot more education than the folks who stay behind pass on that differential to their children. So for example, Southeast Asian immigrants come here, they tend to be poor, but compared to the Southeast Asian individuals who don't immigrate, they tend to do very well. And so they're trying to replicate the class status that they had in their home country here in the United States. And that's one explanation, they say, for why some parents push their kids. How about language? No other issue gets more attention in the area of immigrant integration than language. It's ironic that I have a hard time getting that out. It is my first language, but I'm still not very good at it. It doesn't matter how many studies come out on and are pasted in the headlines of the LA Times and New York Times that say, over time, immigrants and their descendants are learning English. No one seems to believe it. So I will present to you yet another study. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because the evidence is overwhelming. This is a graph of individuals in Los Angeles. If there is any place in the country where Latinos in particular are going to not learn English, it's going to be Los Angeles. Some people have described it as the Latino metropolis of the United States. Yet over time, generation here is indicated along the horizontal axis. And over here, this is the proportion of individuals who speak a non-English mother tongue at home. Over time, across all groups, yes, even Mexicans, that percentage declines dramatically, such that by the third generation, not even 10% of Mexicans are speaking Spanish at home. And if you look at the English ability rates, they're off the charts, even in the second generation, up near 100% for all groups. How about intermarriage? Intermarriage is something that you don't often hear about in the media, but it's something that we talk a lot about in social science, and we think it's a really important indicator of how individuals are interacting with each other in a society. If people are interacting on equal grounds, if they see each other as equal in most realms of life, they're more likely to fall in love with each other and marry each other. And when intermarriage happens en masse, we as social scientists generally take that as the central indicator that immigrant integration is happening. I don't have state-level data for this, but I can tell you that in terms of the United States, California is a leader in intermarriage. Another indicator, you might look to the 2000 census. It was the first time ever that individuals were allowed to mark multiple racial boxes, and Californians, nearly 5% of them marked more than one racial box. California is quite literally a melting pot. And if the trends in the rest of the United States are any indication, that intermarriage increases with length of residency in the United States. This is for Asian and black race groups plus Hispanics. The black bar indicates individuals who were born abroad. The gray bar are individuals who are born abroad but have citizenship, and this lighter gray bar, these are US-born individuals. And intermarriage rates, not surprisingly, between blacks and everyone else remains quite low, and that's because we generally think the social distance between blacks and many different realms of life is wide. Among Asians, among US-born husbands, 32% are marrying non-Asians. 44% of Asian wives are marrying non-Asian men. Among Hispanics, US-born, now this encompasses everyone. This encompasses second, third generation. It's almost 30% are marrying non-Hispanics, 31% among wives. If you were able to break that out by generation even further, even among Mexicans, by the third and fourth generation, you'd get rates in the 40 and 50% range. So intermarriage happens. I'm a product of one of those intermarriages, so I know. How about identity? Identity is something that we talk a lot about in the media too. We want to know, are immigrants changing our country? Are they tearing us apart? Are they shaking the foundation of American democracy? It's a moving target. Identity is a little bit tough to study, although that's my focus in my academic research. And I think the general picture is this, that immigrants and their descendants have always changed American identity. they have always changed who we are, what it means to be American, in ways big and small, in ways that we don't even realize oftentimes. And that is happening today. Immigrants are changing American identity as they adopt that very American identity. They're changing the very mainstream that they move into. A lot of people probably don't think, for those of you who are Christian, when you set up a Christmas tree and you hang up the ornaments, you don't really think, boy, we're really partaking in this fun German tradition, aren't we? Or when a lot of you go and relax on the Russian River on a Sunday, you don't think, yes, we're embracing the German contribution of the leisure Sunday to American society. Those are German traditions that came when German immigrants came here. We talk about a Judeo-Christian American society. 100 years ago, you would have been hard-pressed to get the American mainstream to talk about a Judeo-American society, Christian mainly, not even Catholic. Another, I think, important principle is that changes in identity take place as people pursue their economic interests. Put another way, in a sort of pithy way, assimilation, to borrow a term from social science, is what happens when people make other plans. It's a byproduct of individuals pursuing a better house, of individuals pursuing a better neighborhood, better jobs, more education, and all of a sudden they're thrust into an environment when they're interacting with people who don't come from the same ethnic origin. They fall in love, they change the way they think about themselves because they're interacting in a diverse environment. I'm going to come back to that principle in the end too. Citizenship is one way of thinking about identity among many, and so I want to talk a little bit about citizenship. What's happening with citizenship nationwide and in California? This looks at the number of people in thousands who naturalized over the course of the last 100 years. And there have been many peaks and valleys, and right now we're at a peak. In 2007 in California alone, we had almost 182,000 people naturalized, and that was a 20% increase from the previous year. There's a lot of reasons for that, including the fact that that Department of Homeland Security has now increased the cost for naturalizing to $625, and a lot of people tried to get in before that deadline, and they did. 28% of all naturalizations in the United States happened in California in 2007. 3 of the top metro areas in the nation in terms of the percentage of individuals who naturalized last year in California alone, San Diego, the Los Angeles area, and the San Jose area. But I don't think there's all good news here, and there's something to be done, I think, by the individuals who work in the building across the street somewhere here. 3 million. We still have 3 million people in California who are perfectly eligible to become U.S. citizens but aren't. And by 2010, we'll have another 750,000 who are eligible. And so when we look at California's prosperity, we should be paying attention to citizenship and the potential versus the reality. I want to talk about what I think are 2 very significant roadblocks to immigrant integration. The first is public education in California. Now, I tread lightly here because I realize that I have many teachers in my own family who are working very hard under some very difficult circumstances to make sure that we have a trained workforce. And part of the challenge comes from the fact that so many of these kids are growing up in immigrant families. But the state of public education in California is not doing the job in terms of integration. It's an engine of integration that's running in low gear, and it needs to be revved up. I'm sure all of you read the various headlines that came out, I don't know, about a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago now, showing that the dropout rates in the state were still fairly high, and we can now track individual students by giving them an ID number, and so we know after they leave a school what happens to them. We didn't know that before. And the sad part of the story is that among groups, and again, this is just broken down by race and ethnicity, and I would like the data to be shown here by generation, but we don't have that. But among the biggest immigrant group in the state, Hispanics/Latinos, we have 3 in 10 who are dropping out of high school. And for those 3 in 10, the engine of integration is running far too slowly. And if we think that integration is what happens when people make other plans, if changes in identity is what happens when people make other plans, there are far too many kids in our state who can't make other plans. The second roadblock that I think is quite significant is legal status. Far too many kids growing up in homes where their parents are unauthorized or they themselves are unauthorized, and that is an impediment to integration of incredible proportions. It hurts integration because the kids can't plan for a better future. They can't plan for a better future, A, because they're worried about their parents' legal status, and that is an enormous distraction in the home, distraction from the things that most of us have been able to take for granted growing up as U.S. citizens of U.S. citizen parents. Parents are less apt to be visibly involved in their kids' education. Parents get stuck in low-paying jobs. And for those kids who are unauthorized, many of them who are in our California high schools, in our colleges and universities, at my own university, have no hope of being legally employed in the future. We've become way too familiar with stories of highly successful children who are unauthorized and simply have no hope to be significant contributors to California's economy. Integration, I would argue, is vitally important to California's future. And the importance of integration becomes clear by looking at 2 demographic trends. The first one relates to the graying of our population, and the second relates to the growth of the immigrant stock population. And I'll go through these in a second here. And how many of you are familiar with Dal Meyer's work? I think he actually gave a talk. So some of this might be repeated from Dal Meyer's talk, and he knows that I'm stealing his ideas here, so it's okay. In fact, I talked to him on the phone yesterday. So the first big trend is we're getting old. We're getting old in California. We're getting old in the United States. This tracks the ratio of seniors per 1,000 working age residents going all the way back to 1850. And in California, we've been a little bit younger than the rest of the United States, and still are, no surprise. Or this might just be California effect, people lying, saying that they're younger than they really are. But I tend to think that this is real here. But if you look at how this ratio, again, and take this over the long period that we're studying here, we're looking at this over a 160-year period, that ratio, even in, 2010, these are projections, but slightly before 2000, is incredibly high in a historical perspective. And if Dal Meyer's projections are right, that ratio is going to skyrocket. And so the question is, who is going to make sure that all of these aging baby boomers in California and in the United States, who's going to ensure that they have a comfortable old age? Who's going to buy their homes when they want to downsize? Who's going to take over the leadership positions in our economy, in our city and state government? Who's going to provide the tax base to make sure that the graying population has the services that they need? Who is going to take the wheel of California leadership? Well, the answer, I'm going to skip this graph here, is today's immigrants, and in particular, today's second-generation children. This, again, comes from Dal Meyer's What Would I Do Without Him? And it shows the share of the working-age population, the share of the growth that comes from different generations, share of the growth on the working-age population, that comes from different generations for the past 25 years and then projecting forward. And in the past 25 years, the growth of the working population has come almost exclusively from the foreign-born population and from those third-generation people who are at least the grandchildren of immigrants. And if we look to our future, there's a shift, and that shift is that 59%, nearly 60% of the growth will come from the native-born second generation. All of those kids who I talked about who are now in school who grew up in immigrant households but were born in the United States, and virtually the rest of the remaining growth will come from the immigrant population. I think it's important to point out that the growth will come in particular from one group, to the extent that we can describe them as a unified group, and that's the Latino population. From 1980 to 2005, 40% of the growth came from foreign-born Hispanics, while just 10%, where am I here? While just 10% came from the second generation. 43% of the growth in our workforce, if you take this as an indicator of the growth in our workforce, will come from Latino second-generation individuals alone. So when you open the door to the average California classroom, and you see all of those Latino students who are growing up in immigrant households, those are the kids who are going to be taking the steering wheel of California's leadership and its economy. I think that we can do a few things to ensure that the integration that is inevitably happening happens in a positive way, happens in a way that's beneficial for both immigrants and their descendants and the host population as well. So what can we do? And I'm almost done here. We can do what we're already doing, but do it better. And in particular, we can do a better job with public education. And I love that I can stand up here and just say we can do a better job with public education. I know it's a lot easier said than done, but if there already is not enough impetus to improve our public education system, let immigrant integration add to it. It helps people make other plans. It's an engine of integration that needs to be shifted in higher gear. And there's some evidence from this recent report that came out about dropouts in California that there are some school districts that are doing a pretty good job. San Jose Unified School District, where my mother-in-law was a principal for 35 years, is a majority-minority school district. So is the Santa Ana Unified School District, where 92% of the students are Latino and most of those students are immigrant or second generation. Yet they have incredibly low dropout rates. In Santa Ana, they have less than 10% of their kids are dropping out. San Jose Unified, 13%, well below the state average. As far as education goes, we need to do a better job of offering ESL classes. I am someone who believes that English, the ability to speak English, although not the ability to speak only English, dramatically improves the prospects for immigrants. It improves the prospect of the success for immigrant children. Many of our ESL classes are over-enrolled, they're underfunded, there's a shortage of good teachers, and I might suggest that for some of those graying baby boomers who are looking for something to do to kind of help other people take care of them, they might become ESL teachers, and I know a few have had. And again, it's a benefit to newcomers and their children. Second thing we can do relates to the unauthorized population. Again, this is a major roadblock to immigrant integration, and at the state level, and I know we've tried, but I think we would do well to pass the California DREAM Act. And the passage of the success, assuming that the California DREAM Act passes, and the California DREAM Act would allow California's unauthorized immigrant children to access in-state financial aid at the community college, state, and UC system. The success is predicated on the passage of the federal DREAM Act, because that would give the children, these unauthorized children, the opportunity to actually have the ability to work in our labor force. So I put these two together, but too many of our kids are graduating from California high schools, from California colleges and universities without a chance to be significant contributors to our economy, without the chance to take over that steering wheel that I've been talked about, and we need them. I think the third thing we can do, and I've written a little bit about this, is we can consider a state integration initiative. We tried this in the past. In the distant past, we had assimilation programs that most would argue were ethnically chauvinistic and actually didn't do well as far as integrating immigrants. I think we've entered a new era. I think we've entered an era where we could have some policy involvement. We could have some state involvement in the process of immigrant integration. As a country, We talk exclusively about who's allowed to come in and under what circumstances. In terms of policy, there is absolutely no talk, although that's changed a little bit, about what happens to immigrants after they get here, unless you're a refugee. But for the other 95% of the immigrant population who aren't refugees, there is no integration policy guiding what happens to them. I think an integration policy can focus on English language acquisition. I think it should focus on citizenship. And there are some examples at the local level. Just as local governments are doing a lot in terms of kind of immigration enforcement, they're also doing a lot in terms of integration. Santa Clara County, where I grew up, has a fairly robust immigrant integration program. The state of Illinois is the first state to adopt a statewide initiative aimed at focusing on English language acquisition and citizenship with the explicit purpose of integrating immigrants. New Jersey, Governor Corzine and the governor of Massachusetts recently signed executive orders to start their own integration initiative, and I think these are things that California could look at to help ensure its future. I've spoken for way too long, I think. I'd be happy to take questions or comments now, and I've left up here a list of resources if you're interested that includes some of those immigrant integration initiatives, as well as some private organizations, and then some books that I think cover some of these topics quite nicely. Thank you for your attention. Take some questions now.
A little bit about the initiative that Santa Clara has. You mentioned that they have a pretty robust integration initiative.
Yeah, about 10 years ago, Santa Clara County launched a giant study to understand who its immigrant population was. And Santa Clara County is one of the big immigrant gateways in California. And after getting a sense of who their immigrant population was, they decided to launch an office within the county's Department of Human Relations to do something about integration, and they do a few things. One of the things they've done is very Silicon Valley thing to do. They launched a website where you can find all of the ESL classes in your area. You can find online information about leadership courses that this Office of Human Relations offers for immigrant communities. We know that one of the ways that immigrants integrate in the United States is actually first by building bonds, participating in ethnically based or immigrant-based community organizations. And contrary to popular opinion, that actually facilitates integration. So they offered some leadership training. Every year, they have what they call Citizenship Day. That's at San Jose City College, where they have free legal resources, free orientation for anyone who wants to get citizenship, and they can actually start processing people's paperwork. And this has been incredibly successful. They list the brochure in I forget how many languages, but it's focused on English language acquisition, it's focused on citizenship, and it's focused on building leadership. And then part of integration, of course, is what's happening with the host society. So one of the things that they do is they have a speakers bureau that goes out and speaks to different organizations, NGOs, companies about the immigrant population in Silicon Valley, so that people can kind of better understand who their fellow Santa Clara County citizens are.
You talked about state and local government as venues for discussion of these policy initiatives. Do you have any examples of school governance, educational governance policy that's been discussed? Most schools deal with English learners and addressing English acquisition, but not necessarily in an integrated fashion with other types of policies designed to encourage integration. Have you seen any examples of what school boards or state school agencies or others might have been doing, or post-secondary also?
The short answer is no, I'm not aware of any. There are people who are potentially much better positioned to talk about the specifics of our education system in this room. I won't point them out to save them embarrassment and putting them on the spot. But I don't know of specific examples. You know, I think there are small and big ways that schools can do that. Actually, I take that back. I do know of an example. Santa Maria, California, where I've spent some time doing research, ran their ESL programs through their schools. The parents became aware of their ESL program because kids took home flyers. They offered the ESL classes in the same school where children attended schools. They offered them at hours that worked for many of the parents who work in the agriculture industry near Santa Maria. And so that's one small but I think very effective way that schools have looked at the larger picture of integration, and it's because the school district realized that it made parent-teacher conferences a lot more effective. It meant that parents could monitor their children a lot better. Many of us who've grown up in immigrant households know that kids often become interpreters for their parents, and that shifts the balance of power in dramatic ways when parents can't speak for themselves. And so when parents can, it improves things dramatically. But I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you.
Thomas, there are opponents of immigration, both illegal and unauthorized and legal, who worry that the proximity of Mexico makes the integration of Mexican immigrants much more difficult than prior generations of immigrants who came from Europe and Asia. Can you talk about that issue? Do you share those words?
I don't know that it makes it more difficult. There are sort of competing bodies of evidence. The evidence that I would point to, and I think what most people worry about, is the notion that immigrants are sending all their money back home, they're staying too politically attached to Mexico, and so they don't really feel the need to become integrated in the United States. They have sort of one eye on what's going on here and one eye on what's going on in their hometown in Oaxaca or Jalisco. And over time, even in the immigrant generation, evidence of what they call transnational activity, sending money back, voting in Mexico, running hometown associations, evidence of those kind of ties it declines over time. In San Diego, for example, if there's any place where you'd think that Mexicans are maintaining cross-border ties, it'd be in San Diego, where I currently live. And we're 25 miles away from the border. Among the second-generation second-generation children of Mexican immigrants, about 6% are doing any kinds of transnational activity, going back to Mexico regularly, sending money back, voting, et cetera, et cetera. So the evidence that people are staying tied is not really there. And in my own research, among the later generation folks, you start to get into third and fourth generation, you have these later generation Mexican Americans literally talking about Mexico as quite a foreign land, a place that they're unfamiliar with, and if they're familiar, it's largely with the places that a lot of Americans are familiar with, Cancun, Puerto Vallarta, other places like that. But I think that the academic literature says a lot of things about why Mexicans are the group that is least likely to naturalize, even though they're eligible. And I think part of the reason is that Mexicans sort of carry the dream of going home always, much like a lot of immigrants, but for Mexicans it's a lot more realistic. And if that dream is carried, if you continue to carry that dream, the propensity that you have to kind of set roots down here may decrease a little bit, although you're allowed to have dual citizenship. But we saw a huge spike in naturalization among all immigrants, and including Mexicans. And part of that was a reaction to that fee hike increase. Part of it was a reaction, I think, to the sense that people were feeling threatened in the wake of the immigration backlash in the last couple of years. And so, and I think you're going to see immigrants turn out in huge numbers to vote, largely in response to that threat. So.
If I could just follow up on that question.
Yeah.
Can you speak to the tension that exists, and you said your focus is identity, the fear that coming over and taking over, and how do we resolve that tension? What are your thoughts on that issue?
You know, I'd like to think that as an academic researcher, that if we just publish more research reports, if we just, you know, if we that people, but I don't think people care about that stuff. Unfortunately, I mean, my students do because they want to get an A. But no, I'm being too pessimistic. But I mean, I think one of the things that we can do, and this is something that Dowell Myers has suggested, is really bring to light. Is this me doing this? Or? It is. Okay, sorry. I don't know what's making that happen. One of the things I think we can do, it might be this thing, is really bring to light the fact that our prosperity does quite literally depend on the success of immigrants and their children. That it is actually in the best interest of California voters who are graying, who are largely not from immigrant stock, who are largely white, to vote in a way that vote for schools, vote for libraries, vote for funding for more pay for teachers, vote for things that may not seem intuitively in their economic interest, but in the long term actually is. Dowell Myers has called for the next social contract between baby boomers and immigrants. And the contract says that if the baby boomers do their part to make sure that immigrants and their children have everything they need to successfully integrate, the immigrants and their children will do their part to make sure they're contributors to the economy in a way that benefits the aging population that's going to rely on the services in their tax base. And there's this kind of cycle that goes on. If there's a way to get that message out, if you can appeal to people's self-interest, that it actually does them good to make sure immigrants are doing well, to make sure that, yes, immigrants are getting good, and their children are going to good schools, that they have community centers, that the housing we're building for them doesn't have bars on the windows, then I think that's our best hope. Although I'm not a politician, so I try to create the facts. Well, I don't create the facts. I try to report the facts. That sounded bad, didn't it? Yeah.
Hi, I've got two questions. One, I'm kind of interested in the experience of other countries that are facing significant integration, and in particular Europe, say France with Arab and African populations. Sort of, what are some innovative programs or activities happening in other countries?
Well, France is actually an example. If you hold the United States up to France, we look pretty good. And I mean, I actually think the big picture is that immigrants and their children, as I showed, are integrating. And I think we've shown in this country an incredible capacity to create a place where people can actually do quite well over time. And compared to a lot of countries, particularly in Europe, the United States is quite tolerant. In France, the notion that there is sort of one way of becoming French, that we should stomp out any non-French languages, symbols of religion, that actually has a counterintuitive effect on immigrants. It has the effect of developing what we call in sociology a reactive ethnic identity, and it's an ethnic identity that is rooted in this sort of victim status, the notion that you are a group under threat. And counterintuitively, when you create an environment where people have some opportunity to express themselves, they do so in a kind of non-hostile way. And the example that I'll point to is Canada. And Canada, especially in the academic literature, is always the stick that all academics beat the United States with. But they do everything right in Canada, those darn Canadians. But Canada does a really good job of integrating immigrants. They have a very robust immigrant integration program that involves French and English language acquisition, the two of Canada's official languages. They have what they call a host program that anecdotal evidence suggests is incredibly cheap and highly effective, where they match native-born families with immigrant families, and the native-born families families, act as kind of mentors, show them where the bank is, show them where, how to enroll your kids in school. And this is quite effective, and they've been surprised at the number of people who volunteered to do this. They have an official policy of multiculturalism, and where they recognize in their politics and their policy not kind of large race groups. It's not about Asians and Latinos and Arabs. It's about Chinese immigrants. It's about Portuguese immigrants, Vietnamese immigrants, and they actually fund these ethnic organizations. And within these ethnic organizations, there's a group of leaders that become quite engaged, and they in turn engage their communities in the larger political process. If you ever have the opportunity to invite my good friend and colleague Irene Bloomrad from Berkeley, she's written about the Portuguese and Vietnamese in the United States and Canada, and why Canada does such a good job in integrating them. And it has nothing to do with the point system that they have in Canada versus the United States. So I think that's a model to look to.
The second question deals with a fact of integration, which is crime. And we really talk much about how is crime affecting integration in California.
So there's sort of two parts to the story. Again, it doesn't matter how many published reports come out that show that immigrants are far less likely to commit crime than individuals born in the United States. There's still a notion that immigrants are committing a lot of crime. In fact, there's a University of Chicago economist who thinks that one of the reasons why crime has plummeted in the United States in the last 30 years is because we flooded the United States with a bunch of law-abiding immigrants. And I mean, it's quite possible, right? I mean, if immigrants are 3 times less likely to commit crime than the native-born population, and you have tons of immigrants coming here, well, you flooded the population. A lot of people are working really hard and kind of keeping their head down and not committing crime. The second generation can be a little bit more problematic. The second generation is today and always has been a very precarious generation. They are balancing their parents' immigrant dreams and aspirations with the kind of American reality that they confront. They are, in a lot of cases, individuals who grew up in families where they would never take the jobs that their parents do. They see their parents as sort of chumps who are getting exploited by the man, and they may not be so willing to buy into that.
More difficult if we've lost, if we are losing blue-collar jobs. It's sort of the natural step for people who come with little educations to sort of slowly build up. And if there's no bridge with those blue-collar jobs, we run the risk that the integration that we want to see take place is going to be much more difficult in this new economy.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. The downturn in the economy could have a couple of effects. One of the effects is we're already seeing it, and that's that the number of immigrants crossing the border has declined dramatically. The economic magnet has slowed. But you're right to point out that this may have consequences for integration. One of the differences between the context, the economic context in which integration is taking place today compared to a previous era is that the rungs on the ladder of mobility are a lot further apart. It's not so easy to get a high school degree and kind of get a factory job, a unionized factory job with health care, buy a home, and send your kids to college. It's not easy to do that anymore, and that's why having a good educational system is so important, an educational system that at least provides the opportunity for individuals to climb that ladder, to bridge those rungs on the ladder. And the declining economy, the drying up of a lot of those jobs are jobs that immigrants are doing. I mean, in the construction industry in particular, I mean, that's become heavily dominated by immigrants. So I think the downturn in the economy in some sectors is probably going to impact immigrants more than any other group. But you know, the belt tightening that's taking place already is going to fall hard on immigrants and their children. You know, the fees at the University of California keep going up. College education has become more expensive, not just at the UCs, but across the board. There's less money to provide funding for kids to go to college. Those are all things that affect not just kind of anyone, regardless of their immigration status, but it affects particularly the second generation and immigrants. So yeah, I think you're right to point that out. I think there's a lot of potential with what some people are talking about as the sort of next bubble, although I hate to think about it that way, although California tends to love bubbles, which is which is building a new energy infrastructure. That could potentially create thousands upon thousands of blue-collar jobs that hopefully many of them would go to the second-generation population that isn't finishing, or that is not going to college, and there are a lot of them who aren't going to college. The governor has talked a lot about rebuilding California's infrastructure. Potentially another source of really good blue-collar jobs if we do it right. That's the first time I've ever said that, and I haven't thought about it too much beyond that, but I want to throw that out there. I want to throw that out there. Potentially another good source of blue-collar jobs, but I think you're quite right to point out that the downturn in the economy could have a deleterious impact on their integration.
Thank you, Boss, so much.
Thank you. I'll stick around, too. Thank you so much.